You're not going to grow by studying the Bible. You are not going to grow by studying the Word. You are going to grow.
Hello, and a very warm welcome back to the teaching series, The Jesus That John Knew. I'm so glad you're able to be with me again as we continue to think about John chapter 15 and this amazing story about that Jesus gives us this metaphor, should I say, of abiding in the vine. And we're going to get into that in more detail today. So let's open our Bibles into John chapter 15 and let's remind ourselves of what we've read so far, and then we'll speak some more about it. So Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. And every branch that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself, Jesus says, neither can you bear fruit unless you abide in the vine. Now, last time we talked about the nature, looked at the beginnings of the cast, and we started to think about the vine and the vine dresser and the branches, and talking about, of course, Jesus, the Father, and the body, and we started to talk about that, and humanity being the branches. And we introduced the idea of pruning last time, and I think there's some real value in that metaphor, and I hope that was helpful to you. But today we want to think more about the illustration that I gave you at the end of the last session about grafting. And I want to suggest to you this grafting principle that Paul introduces to us actually is potentially a key for us to really understand how this branch-vine union comes into being. Now remember that Jesus has said at the beginning of this illustration, John 15, and I think you want to see John 15 and Romans 11, I think you want to see those two together. They seem to me to complement one another very nicely. In fact, it's worth making the point that if you really want to understand Paul, you need to have a grasp of John. And if you want to be able to get through John, you need to really be able to understand Paul. The two sort of form a kind of holy knot, if you like. It's actually rather nice when you see the writings of these two together. But Paul's illustration, he uses an interesting metaphor. He uses the metaphor of grafting. Now, in the world of horticulture, grafting is a most intriguing idea because it's about the propagation of plants and bushes and so on. And the idea is that there are two key elements in the graft. You have what is called the scion, that's S-C-I-O-N, and you have the stock. Now the idea is that the cutting is taken from the wild or from the foreign or from the alien, if you like your spiritual metaphors, cut from this vine and is grafted onto the stock of the good vine or the new vine or the true vine, if you want. So the concept is that once you make this cut and you make a similar cut onto the stock, you bring the stock, you bring the scion and the stock together, you join them together like this, and I'll tell you more about the grafting process in a minute, and the idea is that the tissues that are inside both the stock and the scion combine to create something new. And the idea is that the life that is in the stock moves up the stem in through to the grafted piece and to create a new life and a new flower. Now I think that's kind of interesting because for me that metaphor is an incredibly powerful one because it's the absolute picture of salvation. So you have the believer, the scion, is removed from the natural stock, taken off of first Adam, if you like, taken off of the false vine, to be more specific, taken off the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and is grafted onto the new stock, that being last Adam, that being the true vine, and that being the tree of life. And what happens is that from the moment that graft is affected, and you've cut you've cut the stock, the scion, off from the previous vine, henceforth its source of life is derived purely from the stock where it's been grafted on. So it begins to bear the nature, and it begins to bear the image of the stock. And so in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul begins to talk about this, he says, once you bore the image of Adam, the man of dust, but now you bear the image of Christ, the man of the Spirit, the heavenly man. And so the two are in a union now. The life that's in the stock, or if you want, the life that's in the vine upon which you abide on those branches, that life works its way onto the outside of you. And this is, for me, an entirely reliable metaphor, because what it says to me is that there's no inner life that isn't also an outer life. So if something is happening inside of me, it's going to work its way onto the outside of me. And it's a really very simple metaphor, really, but it's a profound one. So what happens is that the believer, the scion, is freed from the old fallen source of life, and now is infused with the new life. And that seems to me to be the kind of picture of what it looks like. First the natural, and then the spiritual, of course. Now, just a few words on this idea of the scion, because I think the idea's got some integrity, and I hope you'll agree. Scions, interestingly enough, now remember those are the cuttings, remember that we're the cuttings. The scions are selected from the previous season's growth, and they select them, the gardeners and people that are interested in grafting, select scions while they're dormant. So they pick the scion that they want to graft while it's dormant, before the growth begins in the spring. So they don't wait for it to flower. They wait when they're taking the graft. They wait for that moment of dormancy, that moment of quietness, that moment where there's no particular outward sign of growth. Now, I don't know, but it seems to me that most people, when they come to salvation, they come to faith, don't come when their life is in full bloom. On the contrary, they seem to come to Christ when their life is either finished, or that it doesn't seem to be opening. It seems to be that period of where they're dormant, where they don't seem to be able to make any progress, where they're not seeming to get the advantages and the advances that they had hoped for. Now, it's interesting that if the scion is left until the spring, there's some danger that when the buds begin to grow, that they'll get damaged and injured during the winter. And the winters are cruel, of course, with grafting. It's important that process, which is very delicate, isn't disrupted. And what happens what the horticulturalists do is they take this scion and they literally bind it securely, and they label it, and then what they do is they put it, listen to this, you'll like this, they put it into moist sawdust or moss, and then they wrap it in plastic material. And they put it in the dark. It's literally like a burial. And they must be kept in a cool place, and there they remain fresh and dormant until the spring. Now, I don't know whether this at all has anything to do with how you would recognise your progress in life, but is there something in that we were sort of snatched away, and you felt like there was a point in your life when you were cut off from something. You were on your way to something, you had an idea about something, you were cut off from that thing, and bound, literally bound tight, that you couldn't move to the left or the right, and then it seemed like you were just thrust into this darkness, covered over with all this dirt, and then just left in this cool or indeed cold place. But in that cold place, you were staying fresh, interestingly enough, and yet dormant until the spring. Now, it is best to graft in the springtime, they tell me, because I won't bore you with it, but it's just interesting, because there's a point about the understock of the trees. They begin to open at a particular time, and there's around the kind of April time is when is the best time to make the graft. And you know what, you can overplay these illustrations, but I tell you, it's interesting that that's kind of around the Easter period, isn't it, when we think about the resurrection. The moment that we've grafted something, the moment that the garden has made the graft, it's immediately covered with a protective coating. It's like electrician's tape, sort of gaffer tape if you like. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sure that once they've taken the stock and they've united it, and it's a union, like I'm doing with my fingers here, what they then want to do is to make sure that that union will take. And so they bind it up with tape, and the tape is designed to literally protect that union. Now, again, this is interesting because I'm wondering to myself, when I think about that bondage, that point where those two are fusing together, where those two are combining to become one new creature, part of me wants to say, I wonder if that's maybe part of the reason for the church. Maybe its point is to be a kind of umbilical cord. Maybe that's the purpose that it serves. And yet, interestingly, with the tape that you bind up this union with, if you don't take the tape away, the plant will die. But if you take it away too soon, the plant will die and the graft won't take. But if you take it away, if you leave it on too long, the graft fails as well. It fails to reach its potential. And I just kind of wonder if there's something about that. But maybe that's for another day and another thought. I've just begun teaching in the Friday night series in London from the book of Acts, and we're beginning to think now about this whole issue of what spiritual community might look like, and asking questions around whether or not we are, anti-church, which we're certainly not, whether or not we're pro-church, which we're thinking about, or whether in fact we may be post-church. But that's a question that really needs to be really unpacked and think through, because there's something about this union, there's something about this relationship and this context which we need to think about. Anyway, that's for another day. Let's talk about the tools that are used in grafting. Number one, there's a budding knife. There's a grafting knife. There's like this fine saw, which is called for a cleft graft. There's pruning shears. And then we have the dormant scion. And then we have the gaffer tape. And then we have this light hammer, which is used for bridge grafting. And then we've got chisels and mallets. We've got all sorts of tools and things that are kind of interesting. And I kind of like this because, to me, what I'm beginning to see here, what it makes me think about, is it makes me think about the nature of how we're joined to Christ. And I kind of want to jump into that, but let me just work to it. You see, the believer, having been separated, sanctified, and grafted in, is going to experience the beginning of a lifelong process of entire sanctification, by the way. The process of becoming who he already is, and that is the agape life of the stock, and it begins to invade and occupy and infuse and inform and fill the believer. This new life of Christ is bursting in, and the stock, that is Christ, extends its life into the believer, and saving, as Hebrews said, to the absolute uttermost. And it just becomes one. It becomes as he is. It just is exactly that. And when we start thinking about this illustration, and I don't know why other writers didn't get on this, and I don't know why people don't teach about it, because I've never heard anybody talk to this subject. But the colours that flow through Calvary's prison, when you think about this, are quite extraordinary. I mean, let's think about something. In order for the graft to take place, two things have to happen. First, you have to cut the scion. So the scion gets cut and cut off. You and I know what it means to have the shears of life cut us off of something we're doing. We're in the middle of something, we're heading somewhere, and yet we got cut off. None of us came to Christ, did we, because we were having a great time. We didn't come to Christ, most of us, through some intellectual decision. The truth is we were cut down, most of us, in the middle of our circumstances. And many of us then found ourselves buried in, well, let's call it sawdust, and put away in the dark. Many of us have known what that means, what that looks like. But then let's think about the stock, because the stock, that is Jesus, that is the true vine, also has to be cut in order to prepare for the graft. So what if The picture of Calvary, when we see this centurion with his sword, when he comes after Jesus is taken down from the cross and pierces Jesus in his side. What if what he's doing, in horticultural terms, use our metaphor, is making the perfect incision in Christ? And now Christ, who is now dead, is open, ready to receive, having made this perfect cut. Now, of course, if Jesus if the cut is like this, if I'm going to match them up, I've got to make a perfect join. So I've got to be able to know that I am going to be cut perfectly in the same way that Jesus was going to be cut, and we move those two pieces together. He suffers everything that I suffer. He goes through everything I go for. In order that what will happen is that I will be placed literally into the side of Christ, grafted into the side of Christ, in order to become the bride of Christ. And the life that will flow out, you remember the blood and the water that flows out, speaking about this new life and this covenant relationship, is this whole picture. So I'm wondering, maybe, if when we hear in Isaiah chapter 53 that he was wounded for our transgressions, and with his stripes we were healed, what we're actually seeing here is we're seeing a new picture. We're seeing the new covenant version of the picture we saw in Eden. Because in Eden, when the Father was looking to create a bride for Adam, and nobody was found suitable, he caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep, as you well remember, and then opened up his side yet again. Do you remember? And out of his side he took the rib of man and built himself a woman. Well, now we have Jesus had died on the cross, and now we have him, Jesus, the last Adam, having his side being open, and his side pulled away like this, and out of his side, instead of this time out of his side coming the rib, what we see now is into his side we see inserted the wild vine, and the wild vine is now inserted, is now placed into the true vine that is Jesus. The skin covers them over, and then they take Jesus away and they wrap him, they bandage him, do you remember? And as he's being bandaged, of course, my point is he's being bandaged, and now I'm saying that the graft that you and I, the branch of the tree of life, tree of knowledge, had been grafted into the tree of life. The bandage that is around the grafting is put around him, and then they take Jesus away and they put Jesus into a cave, as you know, and he sits in this tomb, dormant and quiet in a cold place. And then on the third day, the day of the resurrection, they find that he's taken the bandaging off and he's moved out, not only a new person, a resurrected person, but with a new graft union between man and God. Hallelujah. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what that could look like? You and I may have found ourselves lurking in this season of anonymity, but could it be that this was just our dormant period? Could it be this was just the time we were being prepared to be grafted onto the vine? Can you imagine? What are we going to do about these bindings? What are we going to call them? They're the grave clothes. You remember we talked earlier in this discussion from John, where Jesus sees Lazarus and says, "Take the grave clothes off him." Well, now maybe I think with these bindings that are wrapped around the graft and that were wrapped around Jesus, we have a place finally, maybe, for religion. Because the word religion means to bind back. And here maybe we can find a positive aspiration for it. Because the idea is we could say this is the religion means a binding back, a binding in. And critically, as I've said already, the bandages have to be removed in order for the union graft to take. Perhaps, worse still, it could be the law. Or, I hesitate to say, but maybe it is, as I've already suggested, already hinted, maybe it is the church. Not the spiritual community. No. But maybe it is the institution of the church. And that's something we need to think carefully about. And I'm going to hold my fire on that, but it's a subject that we're diving into, as I say, in London on Friday. And I suspect that when I finish the John series here, after a pause, maybe I'll do a series for you on YouTube here around Acts, because I think it's such a key book for us to understand. But let me just tell you a few things, just in closing this particular vignette out. There are some reasons why grafts fail. Number one, they fail because the scion and the stock are incompatible. Interesting. You can't unite an apple with a plum, for example. you can't put new wine into an old wineskin. You can't combine law and grace. You can't combine religion and spirituality. It just doesn't work. They have to be compatible. Sometimes they fail because the graft was done in the wrong season. There are many of us that have made some confession of faith, that have sort of seemed to have had some experience, and that experience seemed then to have come to nothing. Or grafts sometimes fail simply because they were done in the wrong season. Sometimes they fail because the understock of the scion just wasn't healthy. Sometimes the scions just are not vigorous enough. They're not strong enough for the purpose, or perhaps more specifically, not dead enough for the purpose, if you will. Sometimes they're injured by cold temperatures, and that, I'm afraid, happens to many of us. Sometimes the grafts fail because the scion isn't dormant. My goodness me, whenever there was a reason why we fail to reach our full potential, our full growth in Christ, is because we're not still enough. We haven't learned to abide. Sometimes they fail because the scion and the stock are not meeting properly. And this is a very, very important point, because if you don't get them to connect absolutely and perfectly, the life cannot flow. And I can't tell you how important it is to make sure that you have an understanding of the basic things about God. You're not going to have the life of God flow through you. You're not going to have a proper join if you think God is someone who doesn't love you unconditionally. You're not going to get a proper join and a proper growth if you think you have to work for His acceptance. You're not going to get proper growth and proper life as long as you're thinking that Christianity is a religion, a spiritual cosmic game of snakes and ladders where you're climbing the ladder to perfection. No, not at all. Sometimes grafts fail because they're not properly covered. They've not been preserved properly. Sometimes the grafts fail because they're displaced by the wind or the birds or storms. And I'm sure you can all think immediately of Jesus talking on exactly this subject. The parable of the sower, of course. Sometimes they fail because the scion was in too much shaded area before it began to grow. Sometimes they're damaged because of insects and other things. And sometimes, and crucially, the scion union is damaged because the bindings weren't removed. And there comes a point where you have to take away the binding. There comes a point where you have to loose them and let them go. And I think for us who are people that help try and guide and try and show people into the way of spiritual truth, it's important to remember that there comes a point where we have to take the bandings and the bindings off. There comes a point where we have to just loose them and let them go. Well, that was a little bit of a ramble, but I hope it was at least a useful ramble to you. It's always my pleasure to be with you. God bless you, and enjoy that thought. And I look forward to being with you next time. All right, bye-bye.
You need to understand something about the gospel, and the gospel is that God gathers in the outcasts. The more messed up you are, the more God says, you know what you'll do for me. And the reason why these little children in the Spirit are such powerful people is because they know the Father. And they know something about the Father that is so powerful. They know His love. Little children, I write to you because you know the Father. And if you know the Father, here's what you know. There's one word. Just one word. How can you take infinity and say, describe infinity for me, describe the divine for me. What is it? John says, I can tell you that. God is.